Hello, I'm Adam Levick, co-editor of Camera UK. I'd like to thank you for joining this camera webinar exploring the 11-day war last May between Hamas and Israel, featuring Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. Now, the conflict last May was the fourth outright war between Israel and Hamas in the last 13 years. And though the wars in 2008, 2012, and 2014 differed in many key ways from the one that we witnessed last spring, they all have one thing in common. They were wars that Israel did not start and certainly did not want. As those familiar with Camera's work monitoring the media no doubt already know, they also had one other thing in common. The media coverage obfuscated these intuitive facts, as well as the broader, even more important truth that democratic Israel was fighting not against Palestinians who had a narrow and reasonable demand, but against an anti-Semitic extremist group ideologically opposed to Israel's continued existence within any borders. Writer Shani Moore has characterized the media's failure in this respect as the untruth of framing Palestinian pathologies as legitimate grievances. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Schanzer. Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and has written 4 books about Israel, the Palestinians, terrorism, and the broader Middle East. His latest book, which was published late last year, is Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. Dr. Schanzer will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A. So please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screens if you have any questions you'd like answered. Now over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you to everyone at camera. Andrea, I see you in the audience, so great to be with all of you. As Adam mentioned, I do have a new book out. It came out in November. It's called Gaza Conflict 2021. We put it out through FDD, through Foundation for Defense of Democracies, through my think tank. And I'll just maybe spend a few minutes explaining why I wrote it. I think it is important. I watched the war for the first time really around the clock in Hebrew. Of course, there have been 3 other conflicts of this nature. This was the first time that I was able to really watch it in Hebrew with the language skills that I brushed up on during the pandemic, actually. So just a lesson there. Take advantage of whatever downtime you have. So then I was also able just to watch it more carefully with smartphone, smart TV technology that wasn't really available in 2014 or 2012 or 2009. So I'm able to watch it all in real time. I'm watching the US reporting, watching the Israeli reporting on multiple channels. I'm watching Arabic reporting, and I have to just say that the gap in coverage was truly shocking. I think a lot of us, certainly those of you who support camera, will regularly point to the fact that there is bias in the media. I'm not sure bias begins to cover what I saw during the war. I'm not sure that fake news is a good term to use either. Because I'm not sure what was fake about a lot of it. There were, of course, moments where journalists got it very wrong, but really it was about the decisions made by editors and journalists, their decisions in how they wish to cover the conflict. And there, I have to say, I walked away feeling as if I had seen 2 different wars covered, one in the Middle East and one in the West. That was the gap in coverage was like the Grand Canyon. It really was night and day. It was black and white in terms of the way that things were playing out in the media. And so I decided that after the war was over, I was exhausted. I took a couple of days off, slept off the lack of sleep that I'd had, and then I kind of looked around here in my home office, and I said, you know what, I'm not done with this. The war may be over, but I'm not done with the war. And so that's when I decided to write the book. And I wrote it in, actually the first draft I wrote in 8 days, which I don't know if it's a record, but it was a record for me. I've never written anything quite that fast. I had about 120 pages of text. It's at that point that I went to Israel. And I went and I met with a number of senior officials, interviewed as many people as I could. This was right as Delta was getting its tentacles wrapped around Israel. So I was very lucky to be able to get in and to get out without a whole lot of hassle. And then I came back and edited. And basically the upshot was that we got this book out within 166 days of the ceasefire. And the reason why I really felt like it was important to get it out quickly was because I felt like there was a narrative that needed to be heard, that needed to probably counter the books that are likely to come out on this topic at some point in the near future. And the way that it works is that, this one took us less than 6 months. Usually it takes about a year. So we've got about a head start to be able to educate folks about what actually happened during the war, what people got wrong during the war, and perhaps even some ways to address it or correct it. What I thought I would do today is just very briefly identify a couple of key dates during the war, explain what happened, and perhaps even a lesson or two from what happened during those times. From there, I hope to wrap up, after about 15 minutes, and then we can get to your questions and answers, which are the most important thing to me. I want to hear what you have on your mind, questions that you have. I always find that to be the most exciting part of any conversation. So bear with me as I share some of these prepared remarks, and I do look forward to that discussion. So let's begin with May 10th. May 10th, 2021, that's the day that the war breaks out. And that's when we see rockets being fired out of Gaza into the environs of Jerusalem, which, by the way, is about 50 miles away from the Gaza Strip. Reporters here in America are all pointing to a real estate dispute in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem. For those not familiar, this is an area just outside of the Damascus Gate, outside of the Old City. It's near where the American Colony Hotel is. And according to the reports, according to multiple reports, they say that the reason why we're watching this war erupt is because Israel is about to evict some local Arab residents. This is the reason for the violence. So first, let me just start with a truism, and that is that weapons cause violence, not real estate disputes, not disagreements about who owns what, especially when we're talking about disputes that go back almost a century. And there, I think it's important to note that this all stems from land that was bought legally by Jews pre-1948, before the creation of the state of Israel. And then from there, the Israelis lost that territory in the 1948-1949 War of Independence. The Jordanians occupy it. Nobody really says that anymore, but the Jordanians occupied Eastern Jerusalem, and they held that territory until 1967. 1967, the Israelis reconquered the area. Jews are allowed to go back in, but they don't evict the Arab residents. And what really from there, it begins this legal dispute that winds its way through Israeli courts, and decisions are about to be handed down just before the war breaks out. And this is the reason that people are saying that war is erupted. It was really shocking to me that this is the way that the media would decide to cover it, in the sense that it was just not true. Also, there was no mention of the fact that Hamas had clearly prepared well in advance for this conflict, numerous salvos, lots of rockets ready to fly. But then the other thing that I think is just worth noting here is that, we see this a lot in media coverage. And I'm sure our friends at camera here can tell you all about it, that the media loves to point to single points of friction, single points of failure. So in the year 2000, everybody was blaming the eruption of the Second Intifada, a war that basically stretched on from 2000 to 2005. It was organized violence on the part of the Palestinians, both the Fatah faction and the Hamas faction. They joined forces, wage a war, including suicide bombings and other violent attacks against Israel. And it is all blamed on this idea that Ariel Sharon, then an opposition leader, decided to walk on the Temple Mount, that it was that walk, that stroll, that caused the war. And you still see it today. You still see reporting on that. And of course, there is no single point of failure, right? Another point that I think people often look to, even today, historically, people look at the 1929 riots, one of the first instances of violence between Palestinians and Israelis, pre-state, pre-Israel, right? And they look at the fact that Israel, or rather that Jews brought down Jewish artifacts to the Western Wall compound, and that was what caused the war, right? It's this single point of friction, single point of failure that continues to come up in the reporting. And really, I find it shocking that no one has just dismantled these arguments in a way that deters the press from continuing its habit. But I think this is really lesson one, and that is that there is rarely, if ever, a single thing that prompts these conflicts apart from organized Palestinian aggression. And I think that needs to be asserted often when the next conflict erupts. And believe me, there will be a fifth Gaza conflict. So that's sort of, let's just say that's one episode that we can unpack. Let me move to the second day of the conflict. That was May 11th, 2021. And I remember this very clearly because I turn on my television. I'm watching channel 11 and then I watch channel 13. By the way, I'm not an investor in Apple. I'm not a paid advertiser for Apple, but I have to say Apple TV makes it just so easy to be able to watch Israeli television on your big screen. If you are a Hebrew speaker, I find it to be the easiest, even easier than some of the other technology I've used like Roku. But anyway, so I'm flipping back and forth between channel 11 and channel 13, and I'm watching fireballs reaching high into the air in Ashkelon. And the video really was jarring. And I was thinking about it that, Israelis were watching this as it was on repeat. This video was on repeat as these fireballs are reaching into the night sky. And my immediate thought was that there had to have been some kind of Iranian provided drone, or maybe even a precision guided munition that we have been watching Iran provide to Hezbollah over the years. But it turns out this was a lucky strike. This was a mortar, not even a rocket, that was able to hit a large gas container that was connected to the Ashkelon pipeline. Now, as you all know, Iron Dome is able to stop rockets. Usually 90% or so of them are shot down out of the air, or they are determined to be missing their mark, so the Israelis don't even target the rockets. But mortars can't be stopped, and they can fly for up to 8 kilometers. This one in question probably flew for around 6 kilometers, so not a very long distance. And this was, by the way, according to some IDF officials that I spoke to while I was in Israel over the summer. But the result was, from this one mortar, that we actually saw one of the more devastating attacks in recent memory. Israel, I believe, still has a gag order on this. No one is reporting about it. No one's talking about it even to this day. So that's what I can discern. But here's the lesson from that episode, and that is that Hamas is able to cause great destruction. Israel defenses make that less likely, but these rockets are not harmless. They are not firecrackers, which is what a lot of apologists of Hamas will say, is that they don't do anything. So why is everybody so mad when Hamas fires these rockets? They are deadly weapons. And the media likes to point to the disparity in casualties as proof that Israel is somehow the aggressor. But what they ignore is Hamas's intent, okay? That Hamas Hamas aspires to mass casualty attacks. They aspire to war crimes. And yet that is ignored in our press coverage. And it is remarkable to me that Hamas continues to be able to get away with these sorts of crimes. Now, let me move to the third vignette. And this one was among my favorites during the war. And this was on May 13th. And this was when the IDF tweeted in both Hebrew and English that it had just put assets on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And so from all indications, based on what I saw on Twitter, it looked like Israel had just invaded the Gaza Strip. The Wall Street Journal, AFP, major outlets all ran the story. And in Israel, the reporters didn't. And I actually remember I was outside in my backyard. My wife had yanked me out of the house to do a little bit of gardening with her. It was a nice spring day. And I said, okay, fine, I'm going to take a half hour. But my phone starts blowing up and I see these tweets and I say, okay, I got to go back in. And I turn on the TV, and there was a lot of confusion in the Israeli press that the reporters would not corroborate. I mean, I actually remember, it was really funny. I remember seeing, correspondents on the Gaza border. So they're standing up on that hill overlooking Gaza. Gaza is behind them. And they're on camera looking at their phone saying, my people at the Kiryat, at Israel's sort of Pentagon, can't confirm any of this. And by the way, I'm looking behind me and I don't see troops going on the ground, so we can't confirm this. And so as it turns out, Hamas was the intended audience of those tweets. They flooded the metro system, as it's called. This is this labyrinth of underground tunnels that they had spent years and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars diverting international assistance to create this labyrinth of tunnels. And their goal was to kill or kidnap as many Israelis as possible, right? That they would pop up from these tunnels and they would shoot. They would drag the soldiers into the tunnels, and then they would have leverage against the Israelis in future negotiations. But Israel was ready for them. Israel's intelligence in the Gaza Strip is consistently excellent. And it turns out that this was an information operation of sorts, that Israel took the opportunity once they flooded the tunnels with these Iranian-trained commandos. They started bombing the tunnel system. They couldn't bomb all of it because of human shields concerns, because some of the tunnels ran under schools and hospitals and apartment buildings. But where they had a clean shot, they took it. They destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, and they destroyed a lot of those Iranian-trained commandos. And it was a major victory. I would argue that it was probably the thing that turned the tide of the war. And the journalists here, the U.S. journalists, the foreign reporters, were furious. They were irate with Jonathan Conricus, who was then the spokesperson for the IDF, International Reporters. But in my view, I have to say these reporters had themselves to blame. Because look, if this is a lesson here, if the journalists were just able to watch what Israeli reporters were tracking, what they were reporting, they would not have made these mistakes. The Israeli press corps is an incredibly serious group of reporters. These are not Zionist propagandists. These are not people out there trying to convince everybody that Israel is in the right. That's not what they do. They're actually looking to bring down governments. They're looking to expose the truth at all costs. My experience with Israeli journalists is that they're ruthless, in a good way, by the way. I mean, in a way that you want all of your journalists to be. And American reporters, foreign reporters, there are hundreds, if not thousands of them circulating all over Israel. It's one of the most saturated issues on the planet in terms of news coverage. But yet the foreign reporters seem to have their own agenda. And I think they have that agenda at their own peril. When they decide that they're going to focus on one thing that they deem to be important, or what they hear from Palestinians in terms of spin, rather than looking at what is being reported objectively on Israeli television, I think they do it at their own peril. And so I would say that foreign reporters really must track what local reporters are watching. And just by the way, if you're like a pool reporter, that you're a foreign pool reporter working here in Washington, where I live, and you're trying to cover something out of the White House, are you not going to track what other pool reporters, American pool reporters, are covering? Would that not make more sense, given that these are the reporters that have been doing it for 10, 15, 20, 30 years? Why you would ignore the local reporters who have this expertise is just beyond me. And so I think failure to track what's going on in Israel really comes at great risk for the reporters. Now, the other lesson, of course, out of all of this is just that it's better to win a war than to be loved by the media, especially when you look at the way that the media has covered Israel in the past. I don't think Israel had a whole lot that it was concerned about. It's not like the reporting could get a lot worse, I think, from Israel's perspective. Although it's interesting, the Israelis still say that they did not mislead the foreign reporters on purpose, that it was a mistake in communication from within the IDF. Whether that's the case or not, I leave to you guys to decide. Two more vignettes, I suppose, and then I'll wrap up. One is, let's start with the date. It was May 19th. For 8 or about even 9 days, it looked like President Biden had Israel's back. He never wavered, not when Israel took out the metro system, not when it took down the Jala Tower, which was this large building in the Gaza Strip. He defended Israel at the United Nations. He openly vowed that Israel had the right to defend itself. And by the way, full credit to groups like Camera for making sure that that was a narrative. But on May 19th, we began to see stories. I saw White House reporters, where in some cases, reporters were coming to me and asking for my take on this, that there was a leaked story that Biden was getting tough on Israel. He reportedly he told then Prime Minister Netanyahu that he was done kidding around. And it looked like things were growing tense. And really, as I watched, I began to realize that things were not what they seemed. On May 18th, it was announced that Egypt had brokered a ceasefire and that it was going to go into effect in roughly 48 hours. And that's when we began to see that tough talk. And in my view, this was kind of a blank check for President Biden. He had basically fully understood at this point, from what he was hearing from the Israelis, But the war was over. We saw the cadence of the war drop. The numbers of rockets firing out of Gaza diminished. The number of responses from Israel also diminished. And so basically the war was over, whether it was declared so or not. And that's when Biden, I believe, began to message to the hard left of his party, right? This is the small gaggle of legislators who want to defund Israel or to deprive it of some of its defensive weapons like Iron Dome. Some people call them the Squad. I think a lot of people are right now in calling them the Hamas caucus. This is a small but vociferous element of the party. And it became clear to me that in those last 2 days, it was Biden that was placating them. It looked like things were tense with Israel, but they weren't. Israel, we heard it all the time, actually, in the Israeli press. The word that was used was gibui, that the United States had Israel's back, and that Israel was really openly thankful for this. And that yet, even after all of that, all the thank yous and everything, we began to see this messaging to the hard left. Now, I would just say that there are some good lessons and bad lessons out of this. One is, despite some of the odd optics, I think the US-Israel relations are rather strong. The downside of this is that we have a president and perhaps other leaders within the Democratic Party right now that want to placate the hard left, the extremists. I believe that they're a minority. I believe that they're a very small portion of the party, but yet they're strong enough to make the president of the United States feel as if he needs to message to them, to placate them in some way. Now, I'll wrap up by just saying this. We'll go with today, which is January 6th. This is a crucial moment in the US-Israel relationship. Of course, every day is, and we can't forget that. Every day requires the strategy and effort and care to ensure that the US-Israel relationship continues to benefit both the United States and Israel, and I think it continually does so. But right now, my main concern is Iran. The administration continues to pursue a return to the Iran nuclear deal. They're doing so at Vienna as we speak. It's extremely dangerous. First, let's not believe for a second that Iran intends to curb its nuclear ambitions, but also don't forget that America is looking to remove its sanctions on Iran in exchange for a return to that flawed nuclear structure. And that means that cash will flow to the regime. And that cash will be used to buy more weapons for Hamas. This means more aerial drones, more underwater drones. It means more rockets, more tunnels, more missiles, and more ammunition. We need to repeat this emphatically and often, that Iran is the primary patron of Hamas. This was somehow ignored during the war in May. This was just something that was papered over. And moreover, I would say, it was shocking to me that people weren't, the fact that we were still pursuing this deal, even as the war was going on, wasn't discussed, that there was no friction that was observed by our media. And the point is that what they missed is that if the United States returns to the Iran nuclear deal and provides Hamas with billions of dollars or we provide Iran with billions of dollars of cash and other financial incentives, America will be indirectly sponsoring Hamas, because we know of the pass-through. We've already seen it over the last 6-7 years. And what that means is that the United States will be funding both sides of the fifth Gaza war. And that is not a position that the United States needs to be in. And so here I'll just say that the lesson here, maybe the last lesson for my prepared remarks, is that Iran remains Israel's most deadly threat. We must continue to fight all efforts to strengthen this regime. And it's worth noting that this is not just an Israeli interest. Iran is an avowed enemy of the United States. It continues to harass and target and vilify the United States on a regular basis. So preventing Iran from going nuclear and from getting a financial windfall through questionable diplomacy is a core American interest, and something that I think we must all think very carefully about as we head into a very, very perilous period of diplomacy. I could go on, but I won't. I will turn things back over to our host, Adam. And I thank you really very much for the opportunity to speak with you. Really terrific crowd you guys have assembled today. So I thank you for that. I certainly encourage you to buy the book, and looking forward to Q&A.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. We have a lot of really good questions from people in the audience, but first let me just ask you something. From our experience monitoring the media during the war, and during other conflicts, it always amazes me how few journalists, how few major media outlets even mention to their readers in the course of giving background and contextualizing the war that Hamas is an extremist anti-Semitic organization committed to Israel's destruction. I mean, as basic as that is for those of us who do what we do, can you share any insight on why it is that that's obfuscated?
Look, there's a simple explanation for this, which is that Israel is the Jewish state, and singling out the Jewish state, is a form of anti-Semitism. And I think you can't ignore that could be a component of all of this, that holding Israel to a higher standard than any other country in the world, is a reflection of perhaps some of this sentiments of the media, if not the international community, perhaps a bit of both. I certainly hope that that's not what's driving it, but I think you can't ignore that anti-Semitism or holding Israel to different standards may be a component of that. In terms of why people don't focus on the fact that Hamas is inherently anti-Semitic, or that it is violent, or, by the way, it single-handedly derailed the peace process in the 1990s and was responsible for hundreds of deaths, including Americans, for that matter. I mean, these are things that I think are basic facts that really need to be included in any discussion of any Israel-Hamas conflict, and they're not. They're simply not. You don't even get those kind of primers, those backgrounders that I think would help readers or other media folks comprehend what's going on. A lot of it, I think, has to do with perhaps what happened in 2007, or rather 2006, when Hamas won elections in the Palestinian Authority. Those elections were annulled thanks to pressure from the United States and Arab states, as well as Israel. But that, the policy since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force has been to isolate the territory. So Gaza, which is an area around the size of Washington, D.C., with about 2 million people, has very few entry or exit points. Israel has effectively blockaded the territory. They're not doing it because they want to inflict harm on the people, but they're doing it because they're afraid of what happens if Hamas gets more assets, if they get more weaponry, if they get more money. What does that mean? It likely means more war. So Israel has done whatever it can to isolate it, but they take a lot of grief for having done so. And I think it kind of it contributes to this notion that this is a fight between David and Goliath, of course, with Hamas and the entire Gaza Strip being cast as David.
Okay. All right, I have a question from Mark. He's frustrated over criticism of Israel during the war by some of his progressive Jewish friends, and just wants you to comment on, is there any particular line of argument or reasoning that, that this person who's clearly frustrated by it, can clearly engage in, that might be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, look, the first thing is that you need to understand a couple things. One is that the Arab-Israeli conflict is shrinking. Even the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is shrinking, right? You see more countries being pragmatic with Israel, normalizing with Israel, or just simply not fighting with Israel. So what you're really talking about is a war that exists between the Gaza Strip and Israel. So then you need to unpack that a little bit further and find out, okay, well, who's driving this conflict? Why did this come about? And I think we need to get back to really two things. One is that Hamas is a violent organization. It's in its charter from its founding in late 1987, early 1988. It vows for the destruction of the state of Israel, and everything that it does builds upon this very simple notion that Hamas needs to emerge victorious over the Jewish state at any cost, including bloodshed. And it's got this long history that, for anyone who wants to read it, and even the books written by Hamas figures themselves, some of which I have on my bookshelf right behind me, you're still going to see people openly acknowledging that this is the goal of Hamas, okay? And that it doesn't matter what Israel does. Israel's existence is the reason for Hamas violence. And that is something that I think is fairly easy to explain, that there is no appeasing Hamas. There is no working with Hamas, despite what anybody says about moderate factions or splits between political and military wings. That's just not a thing, okay? But the reason why they're even more dangerous now is that they're state-sponsored. And here I think, and I get into great detail in this in the book, the number one state sponsor of terrorism in the world is Iran, and Iran is Hamas's #1 state sponsor. Okay, they give them the weapons, they give them the training, they give them hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. By the way, this is not me talking. This is the CIA talking. It's Canadian intelligence. It's Israeli intelligence. There are volumes of literature explaining this patron-client relationship and what Iran has done to teach Hamas in order to be able to wage these wars effectively with greater technology and with greater voice each round. So each round we've seen improvements upon this thanks to Iranian largesse. Okay, Hamas gets stronger and more vicious as a result. But by the way, it doesn't end there, because there are 3 other state sponsors that I think are worth noting. One is Qatar, which is largely described as this moderate influence in the region. They're trying to broker calm between Israel and Hamas. Not the case. Qatar is providing tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars and all sorts of political and diplomatic support to Hamas. There is no moderate Gulf actor here right now that's actively involved. Okay. Then the 3rd state sponsor is Turkey, which is a bizarre thing given that Turkey is a member of NATO. But they have the largest Hamas presence, military, financial, diplomatic, political. Outside of the Gaza Strip, it's their largest presence in the world. And the fact that you have the president of Turkey trying to whip up angry sentiment inside the Gaza Strip, inside Israel proper, should not be lost on anyone. But these are outside actors that are trying to impose their will, and they use Gaza by proxy in terms of attacking Israel. You need to blame them for it, not Israel, not even the people of Gaza, but rather these outside actors that are looking to whip up this kind of sentiment. The last one, by the way, is Malaysia. And that's one that doesn't get a lot of coverage these days. But Malaysia is a place where a lot of Hamas students go to study engineering and weapons design and weapons manufacturing. Some of them have actually learned some terrorist tactics and trained in Malaysia. And it's just so interesting that this is a country that America largely sees as, a middle of the road country, a country we want to support. So there's, I think, a lot of work to be done in the media in terms of getting our reporters, and I would say probably a lot of folks on the left that don't want to see the full picture, to get them to understand that it's not even great power competition, it's mediocre power competition with Israel, right? They're looking to find ways to undermine the Jewish state wherever they can, and they've been successful thus far because they're not called out. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. All right. So we have a lot of good questions. I want to get to some more. David wants to know, he's a question about, if I can paraphrase, within the dynamics of intersectionality, Israel is often portrayed as the white guy oppressing people of color. And he wants to know whether or not, from a Hasbara or public relations standpoint, it would be helpful if Israel, when they had people from the government speak on live TV, whether those people were Ethiopians or Jews of color, whether that would have any difference to how they were perceived.
Look, I think that's maybe something that could be useful for Israel. I think of it as something of a gimmick or kind of responding to the woke mob. At the end of the day, I think, Israel should be promoting its spokespeople based on merit, based on knowledge, based on understanding of the region, language, and all of that. I think it's interesting, by the way, if you read Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. I just actually read it over break. And, she sort of interestingly points out that Jews fall in between whites and people of color, that we're neither. We don't belong to either. And that's one of the things to point out here when sort of weighing what the woke mob wants or how to placate it. But really what I would say is, from Israel's perspective, if it's looking to maybe gain ground, one of the things that I pointed out in the book is that Israel is fighting what it describes as the war between wars. Milchama ben hamilchamot is or mabam, as they call it in Hebrew. And the idea is that Israel is constantly looking to erode its enemy's capabilities in between the conflict. So there's this asymmetric thing that's going on where Israel's bombing Iranian assets in Syria. They're taking out cyber assets. They're taking out nuclear assets. They're targeting ships on the high seas. they're doing all this in a way that preserves deniability, that allows Israel to say it wasn't them, or in some cases they may own up to it, but it's all done in this very asymmetric fashion, right? But they don't rest in between the conflicts. And I think my advice, having talked to some of the Israeli officials about how they dealt with the kind of PR component of the war, is they need to think about the war between wars on a public relations level as well. They need to get out and actually start explaining to people how they fight these wars. I mean, when I sat in that Southern Command Operations Center in a month or so after the war, and I looked up at all the screens, and I saw how amazingly technologically connected this operations center was to the Gaza Strip. All the bells and whistles was remarkable. And then you talk to the Israelis about how they use that. And what they do is they're constantly identifying legal targets in advance before they start to bomb in the next campaign. They're collecting them now. They don't want to use them, but they will use those targets because they've been approved legally. And then look at the way that the war itself is being fought. The small number of casualties is truly remarkable. And people seem to forget this, that 211 people, I think it was, of course, every casualty, every death is absolutely lamentable and not something that you ever want. But the fact that you had 11 days of war, 4,000 rockets fired by Hamas, roughly 3 times that fired in response by Israel, and you had such minimal loss of life, I think it's a testament to the way that Israel fights its wars, but yet I don't think that's properly understood. And I don't know if a spokesman of color, not of color, I don't know if that matters. I think people need to learn this in between the conflicts. And that's what I would say the Israeli communication space really is lacking.
Okay, Ruth wants to know whether or not you think that foreign reporters who were in Gaza felt free to report the truth, or whether they were intimidated by their Hamas handlers.
Well, I talk about that in one of the chapters of my book on the Jala Tower episode. This is that tower that Israel destroyed, and at the time Israel was absolutely hammered by the press, specifically by Associated Press and by Al Jazeera. I know you guys spent a lot of time looking at this at the time, Adam. But what went unnoticed was the fact that inside this building, there was an office that Hamas had that was deploying technology that was designed to jam Iron Dome. And if Iron Dome had been jammed, thankfully it wasn't, but it could have actually led to thousands of casualties during the war, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. And I think, we should all consider ourselves lucky that that didn't happen. But the fact that Israel decided to take it out, it began to take a huge amount of heat. And, the allegation was that Israel was deliberately targeting the press, trying to encumber the press. And yet, there was this open question of, well, wait a minute, what did AP know about this office in their building? Now, I'm not saying that it said like in the elevator, 5th floor, Hamas office. I'm not saying that, but you have to wonder what they knew in the first place. And that, of course, gets us back to an essay that I talk about in the book, written by Mati Friedman, a journalist who actually worked for AP, who noted in the Atlantic back in 2006 that Hamas was operating in the environs of the AP offices, and that no one was reporting when rockets were being fired from their immediate area. They were actually deliberately keeping quiet. This was something that was confirmed by one of Mati's one of his colleagues over at AP as well. And you just get a sense that look, Hamas is a terrorist organization, right? They don't play by the same rules as the West. And so if you want to live in the Gaza Strip, you want to work in the Gaza Strip, there are clearly going to be rules that you need to abide by if you want to live, if you want to be able to continue to work. And so this, I think, was lost on a lot of people. And by the way, I'll put this out there. When you look at the coverage, and I mean, you could look at it in Hebrew, you could look at it in Arabic, you could look at it in English. Ask yourself how many times you see live coverage of Hamas fighters firing rockets into Israel, even recorded coverage of the aggressors out of Gaza, the people who started the war by firing rockets in the first place. How often do you see coverage of that? In my experience, there's very little of it. You often see the drone coverage that Israel provides, where you see these little figures from high above with a kind of a grayscale background where the Israelis are targeting someone who's about to fire a rocket. But it seems pretty clear to me that Hamas doesn't allow for the open circulation of journalists to cover how Hamas fights its wars. You don't see, people being attached to some of the commando regiments that are in the tunnels. You just don't see this in the same way that Israelis openly allow for their journalists to embed. So I think that should probably answer your question, but I'm happy to answer further if need be.
You also mentioned in your book that Al Jazeera was located in that building, and Al Jazeera, of course, is owned by Qatar, sponsor of Hamas. That would seem to be a big, story angle that media could have covered at the time.
Oh, that was a joke actually for a couple of reasons. One is you're talking about the country of Qatar, which is a huge state sponsor of Hamas. And, right. No one talked about this. The fact that the Qataris have pledged or given tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to Hamas. And people are like, oh, well, Al Jazeera is different. It's separate. It's independent. I'm sorry, it's not. But, maybe three other little anecdotes to add here. One is that the United States government, the United States military has targeted Al Jazeera because it somehow appears, its reporters have appeared miraculously 2 minutes before attacks against American personnel in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And the United States has actually targeted Al Jazeera facilities in the past because of the concern that they're working with terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So I think that should be an indication, number one, of how maybe not quite so legitimate Al Jazeera is. So that's one. There's another interesting little nugget that came out of this that no one seemed to notice at the time. And that was that Layla Al-Arian, a woman who identified herself as an Al Jazeera producer, wrote an article, an op-ed in the New York Times the day after the Jala Tower was destroyed, where she was just excoriating the Israelis for destroying her family home, etc. One thing that she didn't note in her byline was that she is the daughter of Sami Al-Arian, who was brought before an American court in Florida for supporting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I'm sorry, but someone explain to our public how this can even get past the editors at the Times. It was shocking to me. And one last little note was, it was really kind of fun to watch that Al Jazeera's management showed up it was Hamas showed up at an Al Jazeera office and presented Al Jazeera's management in Gaza with an award for their exemplary coverage of the conflict in the days after the war. So you just get a sense it's a little bit too, a little too friendly between Hamas and Al Jazeera. I think that should be explored a bit more before the fifth round begins.
Yeah, I agree. Judith wants to know about, during the war, there was a fury of anti-Zionist sentiment within academia. And I think I recall there was dozens of statements from academic associations condemning Israel in really the most strident terms. And she wants to know if you have anything to comment about anti-Zionist activism during the war, specifically within academia.
Look, within academia, I would say it's par for the course. We've seen this in all the previous, the two intifadas, and of course now the 4 different Gaza wars. By the way, you see it all the time with just even in response to, small one-off exchanges between Hamas and Israel. Anything that happens, it's always Israel that is, committing war crimes. It's an excuse to once again try to engage in boycotts of Israeli academics. We saw MESA, the Middle Eastern Studies Association, launch an initiative along these lines. What passes for academic reporting is actually embarrassing. It's a problem, by the way, that stretches back years. We're talking about 3-4 decades now. There's a great book by a scholar named Martin Kramer called Ivory Towers on Sand. I think it was published in 2001. So it's more than 20 years old now, but it's amazing. It's worth reading even to this day because it looks at the silliness of the academic space in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the overwhelming exaggeration that we see on the part of these academics. So more of the same during this war. I don't know if there's any one person I'd point out. Maybe Columbia is perennially a bad school for this kind of thing, but we saw it really across the board, and it's a real shame.
Okay, James has a follow-up question about the tower that housed AP and Al Jazeera, and that he read somewhere that the IDF was hesitant to give the Biden administration specific intel on the electronic interference that they were using. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I mean, according to the reports that we saw, the IDF did not hand it over before the strike. They handed over the intelligence afterwards, and it apparently satisfied the Biden administration. And that was kind of the end of the controversy as far as the White House was concerned. But you have to remember that was after the damage had been done. The allegations started flying the moment that tower, the Jala Tower, was destroyed. That's when, AP, as well as Al Jazeera, as well as, Reporters Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, I mean, you name it, whatever the organization was, they came out. If they were inclined to be anti-Israel before, you wouldn't believe the kind of, vitriol that was coming out of the Twitter feeds at the time. Again, the Israelis did ultimately settle that account with the Biden administration, but they did not share all of that intel with the public. So I think right now there are those still in the public space who are saying, well, wait a minute, that's not proven, or how do we know that this was actually the case? My assumption is that it really has been settled, but save for those that want to keep the issue alive.
But your understanding is that the Biden administration accepts the evidence that was provided by the Israelis?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Joe wants to know, speaking about Iran, if Israel is doing all it can to stop the flow of money from Iran to Hamas, or the flow of expertise, like is everything possible being done to stop that assistance that Iran provides Hamas?
Look, the answer is yes, short of really drastic and extreme measures that would amount to collective punishment on the Gaza Strip. And I think the Israelis are trying to sort of strike a balance between, allowing the flow of goods and services into the Gaza Strip while also really doing whatever they can to restrict the flow of weapons parts, and as well as human expertise, which is a huge problem, because what's happened over time is it used to be that, Iran would smuggle a lot of these weapon systems, usually in tunnels through the Sinai Peninsula. Usually they were smuggled from Sudan, and then they were brought up north to Sinai, and then the Bedouin would derive some, financial benefit from smuggling into the Gaza Strip. That's stopped in large part due to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the ruler of Egypt, who has really worked very closely with Israel to prevent that activity, much more so, by the way, than Mubarak before him, and certainly more than Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. But at any rate, the point is that that they've done a lot to get rid of that underground smuggling. So what we have left is above ground, or the occasional tunnel that's still operational. But they're doing quite a lot. The one that I'm more concerned with right now, and I also talk about this in the book, is what's happening in the north, that there is a huge amount of smuggling that is taking place by way of Iran through Syria into Lebanon. And the goal is to provide precision-guided munitions to Hezbollah. And Israel, as we all know, is bombing on a fairly regular basis in Syria, and they're taking out a lot of these weapon systems before they reach Lebanon, but they're not getting all of them. And so that means that PGMs, these precision-guided munitions, are being accrued by the dozens, maybe even by the hundreds, according to some Israelis that I've talked to. Now, why is that concerning? Well, PGMs enable Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, whoever, to be able to strike within about 5-10 yards of the intended target, which means incredible accuracy, but also there is the ability to potentially evade Iron Dome, because you can steer these things. You can steer them left, right, down, up, etc. So there are these evasive tactics that we might see with PGMs. So I have to say that the rockets that are coming out of Gaza right now are still, all things considered, they're not keeping Israeli war planners up at night. It's the PGMs up north that really has the IDF nervous. And in fact, Yair Kochavi, who's the chief of staff for the IDF, he has actually called PGMs the #2 threat to Israel's security. second only to the Iranian nuclear program. So I would just say for those watching at home, watch that space in Syria, look at how things are going boom in the middle of the night. Look at some of those operations where Israel's being accused. You'll know why they're doing it now. And then, at some point you have to ask yourself, when does this spill over into Lebanon itself? At what point does Israel feel like it's going to need to do something proactively because it cannot allow for the accrual of these PGMs beyond where they are?
That's a perfect segue to a question by Dave, who describes himself as a 25-year recovering reporter, a 4-decade resident up north, and he wants to know if the government's doing enough or doing anything to prepare the international media, prepare its allies for the potential war against Hezbollah.
I have to say, getting back to that war between wars mentality, I think there's a lot that Israel's going to need to do to prepare the world for what may happen. Of course, they've got their hands full as they think about potentially carrying out a preemptive strike against Iran, which is a whole other set of PR landmines that I suppose they're tiptoeing around right now. But within Lebanon, I think there's a real problem. And by the way, I think it's worth noting two things that are going to complicate Lebanon even further. One is that Lebanon is on the verge of a total economic collapse. The assessments that I've seen by top-notch economists suggest that the country, and remember, this is a country that's about 5 million people, roughly, I don't know, the size of Delaware. It's got $120 billion worth of debt. That's just insurmountable for a country that's just got no exports to speak of. And so you're looking at a potential collapse scenario coming soon. And that really could make it sort of look like Somalia on the Mediterranean. As far as Israel's concerned, if it gets involved in a conflict, it's going to be very difficult to explain what it's doing there if it creates additional challenges for the Lebanese people who are already drowning in debt and political dysfunction. But the other thing that was interesting to me during the war in May, and I wrote about this, and in fact, there's a document that I have in the end as an appendix. There were rockets that were fired during the war from the north. There were 6 of them, if memory serves. And Israel didn't have to respond to most of them because they didn't hit anything of value. Israel kind of just responded with light artillery fire and sort of just wanted to ignore that and really not have to deal with the second front. But one of the things, as I watched all that happen, it dawned on me that I had received a letter back in 2018 from an Israeli contact of mine. This was a guy that shared with me a letter written by Danny Danon, the then ambassador from Israel to the UN, where he warned the United Nations that Hamas was setting up military infrastructure in Lebanon with the intent of dragging Israel into a 2-front war. This is, I think, what Israel needs to be really clear about. It needs to draw some lines in the sand. It needs to continue to warn the international community that Hamas may try to do this, perhaps even in coordination with Hezbollah, that they're just looking for a good excuse to draw Israel into that second front. And of course, we all know that Israel abhors those 2-front conflicts. 1973 was just a disastrous moment for Israel. They obviously came back and were able to gain equilibrium, but that's not something that I think anyone in Israel would welcome anytime soon.
Okay, jumping to the third front, Clyde wants to know if Israel could take out Iran's nuclear facilities without U.S. help.
I think those who know aren't talking, and those who don't know seem to be talking a lot more. I have to say, I don't know. I know that Israel doesn't have the bomber capabilities that the United States has. We don't have that long range, or we have that long range, they don't. And so there, I think, are some real questions about the conventional capabilities that Israel has. But I also have to say, there are the capabilities that we know Israel has that we don't see in the light of day. And I mean, there are cyber capabilities. There may be things that Israel can continue to do to set back the Iranian nuclear program without having to engage in a kinetic conflict. And then there's all the planning that's gone on really since 2012. You think about it, the Israelis have been chewing on this problem for the better part of 10 years. If they don't have a plan by now, then there is cause for real concern.
Okay. David wants to know what you think of parachute journalists and whether their lack of Hebrew is a major impediment to their reporting.
Look, I would say that yes, it's an impediment only in the fact that you can deal with journalists in English in Israel. Everybody knows that. If they even hear an American accent in your Hebrew, they're going to switch to English anyway, and you have no choice in the matter. This is, I see Adam nodding his head. Anyone who's lived in Israel, traveled in Israel, you will know that you better sound Israeli when I actually speak Hebrew with Israelis. So, forgetting about that for a minute, there is the question of if you're not reading the news in Hebrew, if you're not, because honestly, you're not going to pick up the same stuff when you read the Jerusalem Post or the Times of Israel, both excellent publications, but not as in depth as you're going to get on, I don't know, Walla or Haaretz or Yediot or any of the other publications where they really take deep dives into a lot of these subjects. It's really important to be able to do those surveys of the foreign media that you're covering as a journalist if you want to be able to navigate. You need to be able to spot things that are not being reported in the US in order to add value, rather than just regurgitating what reporters are saying to you in English or that officials are saying to you in English. How do you know even where you can catch them in lies? How do you know when you're going to be able to catch them in some discrepancy? These are all things that if you're not using the local language, I think you're just operating at a disadvantage.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. This goes to Sammy, friends of ours. He wants to know what you think the impact and effectiveness of Israel's new fence along the Gaza border will be in terms of the next conflict.
Oh, I mean, it was terrific. I actually wrote a piece with a guy named Jacob Nagel. He's a former national security advisor to Bibi Netanyahu from several years ago. And we wrote about the fence before it was actually complete. And the fence is miraculous in that it actually now prevents tunneling underneath. There's sensors, there's all sorts of stuff that they have. There's above ground stuff that you can actually see, of course, and multiple layers. But the bottom line is that it's really almost brought to a complete end, that tunnel challenge that I think all of us became acutely aware of in the 2014 Gaza-Israel war. And that threat was, I think had people's hair on fire for a time. I think that's no longer the case. Israel, I think, feels a lot better about the way that they've choked off possible infiltrators. It doesn't mean that there are no tunnel threats left. And certainly, I think Israel is going to have to stay vigilant on the north as well. As we know, they've intercepted or destroyed a number of Hezbollah tunnels. So it's a tactic that they're going to continue. But honestly, I think for my money, I look right now at the major threat that's coming. It's PGMs, those precision-guided munitions. Hezbollah has them, Iran has them, and uses them, by the way, against American forces. The Houthis in Yemen appear to possibly have them and may use them to try to target Eilat, at least according to some reports. And then there is the question of whether Hamas is trying to get them. If it does, then that really changes the game. And remember that it's not just, oh, well, they're firing one rocket, so maybe Israel needs to fire 3 Iron Dome batteries to take out 1 PGM. That is, I think, a simple explanation for what might need to happen. But just remember that when these PGMs are going to be fired, they're going to be fired in salvos where they're hidden among regular unguided rockets. So it'll be extremely difficult for IDF, rocket defense, missile defense operatives to be able to identify what's what, to identify what requires more missile defense. And so there are some real challenges ahead, I believe, in the missile space, not necessarily the underground space, although that's one, of course, that we all should continue to watch nonetheless.
Okay, listen, Jonathan, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk, and I think we got a lot of really interesting and well-informed questions. Again, I just want to recommend the book that I finished reading by Jonathan. It's entitled Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. It's available at Amazon and anywhere else books are sold. There it is. And so I recommend everyone to go out and buy it. It's just a great reference, and hopefully Jonathan will be writing some more books about similar topics in the near future. I just recommend everyone check us out at camera.org. We have a very active Facebook page, and we're very active on Twitter. And again, thanks very much.